Keanu Reeves stood silently in line at the supermarket, dressed in his usual understated way, blending in with the crowd. But today was different. Ahead of him, a frail elderly woman counted coins with trembling hands, her voice barely audible as she apologized to the impatient cashier. The young man behind the register sneered, his sarcastic remarks growing louder, drawing murmurs of agreement from the restless customers in line. The woman's cheeks flushed with shame as she struggled to pay for her meager groceries, her dignity slipping away with every passing second. Keanu's calm gaze swept over the scene. He didn't seek attention, but this wasn't just impatience, this was cruelty. What Keanu did next would not only change the woman's day, but teach everyone in the store a lesson they'd never forget. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. The small neighborhood supermarket was bustling with life, a place where chatter mixed with the rhythmic beeping of checkout scanners. Bright sunlight streamed through the large front windows, casting long shadows over the crowd of shoppers moving hurriedly between aisles. It was a typical late afternoon, full of the usual mix of families grabbing dinner supplies, tired workers picking up essentials, and students with snack-laden baskets. At the farthest checkout counter, an elderly woman stood, clutching a small basket of groceries. Her figure was frail, and her neatly pressed but faded coat hinted at a life lived with quiet dignity. Her name was Margaret. She carefully placed a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a handful of potatoes onto the conveyor belt, her hands trembling slightly as she did. "You're not in here for price, are you?" Behind the register stood a young cashier, no older than 20, with an air of impatience etched across his face. He drummed his fingers on the counter, his expression growing more sour as Margaret reached into her bag, pulling out a small, worn coin purse. Margaret's movements were deliberate but slow. She counted each coin with precision, her lips silently mouthing the numbers. As the line behind her grew longer, some customers shifted uncomfortably, their sighs and muttered complaints filling the space. "Seriously?" the cashier muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Margaret and others to hear. His eyes flicked to the growing line. "Come on, lady. People are waiting," he added, louder this time. Margaret's cheeks flushed pink as she looked up, offering a nervous smile. "I'm sorry. I just need a moment. These hands aren't as quick as they used to be." The cashier let out an exaggerated laugh, shaking his head. "A moment? You've already taken 5. His voice dripped with sarcasm, and a few customers in line chuckled uncomfortably, not daring to intervene. Margaret's hands trembled more noticeably now as she fumbled with the coins, her embarrassment evident. The sound of laughter and impatient murmurs around her felt like an invisible weight pressing down. But not everyone in the line shared the sentiment. Just a few feet behind her stood a man, dressed plainly in a black jacket and jeans. A baseball cap shaded part of his face, but there was no mistaking the kindness in his steady gaze. Keanu Reeves had come to the store for a quick errand, blending effortlessly into the crowd as he often did. He watched the scene unfold with quiet intensity. The frustration of the cashier, the suppressed chuckles of the onlookers, and the silent struggle of the elderly woman painted a picture that made his chest tighten. Keanu's hands instinctively moved into his jacket pocket, where he felt the crisp edges of a $20 bill. He would step in, but he waited, giving the situation just a moment longer. The cashier's tone grew sharper. "Do you even have enough to pay for all this? Because if not, you're wasting everyone's time." Margaret's eyes filled with unshed tears, and her lips parted to respond, but no words came out. And that was when Keanu, calm yet deliberate, took a single step forward. "Excuse me," his deep, steady voice cut through the tension like a knife. "But I think I can help." As the cashier's words lingered in the air, the scene froze momentarily. Keanu's calm intervention had halted the growing unease, and for a brief second, Margaret looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. Behind that quiet gaze lay a lifetime of struggle, a story she carried with her every day. Margaret Thompson had lived a life that was as ordinary as it was quietly heroic. Born during the tail end of the Great Depression, she had learned early on how to make do with little. Her father worked long hours in a factory, while her mother took in sewing to keep the family afloat. Margaret grew up believing in hard work, kindness, and sacrifice, principles that would carry her through the decades. Life had not been easy for her. She had raised 2 children as a single mother after losing her husband to an unexpected illness. Balancing her job as a seamstress and the demands of parenthood was a constant juggling act, but Margaret never complained. Instead, she poured everything into her children, ensuring they had opportunities she never did. But the years had a way of taking their toll. Margaret was now retired, living on a modest fixed income that barely covered the necessities. Trips to the grocery store were carefully planned, with every dollar stretched to its breaking point. Today, she had debated whether she could afford the loaf of bread, but Liam, her 8-year-old grandson, had begged her for his favorite cookies. She couldn't say no, not after the loss of his mother. Margaret had always been resilient, but moments like these, public displays of her vulnerability, shook her confidence. Her trembling hands counting out coins to pay for groceries were more than just a sign of age. They were a reflection of how hard she worked to maintain her dignity despite the odds stacked against her. On the other side of the counter, Alex Winters, the young cashier, saw the world differently. To him, working at the supermarket was a temporary stop on his way to better things. Or at least that's what he told himself to get through the grueling shifts. Alex had taken the job reluctantly, believing he deserved more than minimum wage and impatient customers. He'd been raised in a family that prized appearances and status above all else, and he carried their lessons into his interactions. He saw Margaret not as a person, but as a nuisance, a roadblock slowing him down when he just wanted to get through the day. Deep down, Alex wasn't a bad person, but he lacked the perspective to see past the surface. He didn't understand the weight of Margaret's struggles or the sting of his dismissive remarks. To him, her fumbling was simply another inconvenience in a long line of frustrations. Keanu, standing silently in the background, had his own reasons for stepping forward. A man of global fame and fortune, he was no stranger to the spotlight. Yet he had never let his success erase the lessons of his own struggles. Growing up, Keanu's life had been marked by instability. His family had moved frequently, his father had left when he was young, and his education had been disrupted by his constant need to adapt to new schools. Despite these challenges, Keanu had always clung to a sense of hope. As an adult, tragedy continued to touch his life. The loss of his close friend River Phoenix, the heartbreak of losing a child, and the passing of his former partner Jennifer Syme had all shaped his perspective on the world. Keanu understood loss, pain, and the fragility of life. And he also understood how small acts of kindness could make an immeasurable difference in someone else's life. This was why he found himself here, standing quietly in line behind Margaret. He hadn't planned to intervene. It wasn't his style to draw attention to himself, but seeing her struggle, hearing the cashier's callous remarks, and feeling the weight of the room's silence left him no choice. Keanu didn't see Margaret as an inconvenience or a stranger. He saw her as someone who needed compassion, someone who reminded him of the people he'd loved and lost. He thought of his mother, who had worked tirelessly to raise him and his sisters. He thought of the countless times he'd witnessed others being overlooked, dismissed, or humiliated simply for being vulnerable. And so, as Margaret fumbled for her last coin, Keanu stepped forward, not as a Hollywood star, but as a man who believed in doing the right thing when it mattered most. The soft hum of the supermarket was broken by the cashier's sharp tone, cutting through the quiet determination of Margaret as she counted her coins. The impatience in his voice was unmistakable, as was the growing unease among the customers waiting in line. "Ma'am, if you don't have the money, you're going to have to step aside," Alex said, tapping his pen against the counter for emphasis. His voice had an edge to it now, louder than necessary, as though he wanted the whole store to know about Margaret's struggle. Margaret's hands froze, trembling above the stack of coins she'd been carefully placing on the counter. Her vision blurred slightly, tears threatening to spill as her humiliation deepened. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. I just need a moment," she whispered. her voice cracking under the weight of the stares surrounding her. Behind her, one of the customers, a middle-aged man in a business suit, shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable. Some people really need to plan better before shopping." His words weren't directed at anyone in particular, but they hung in the air, a cruel reminder of Margaret's perceived inadequacy. The cashier smirked slightly, emboldened by the murmurs of agreement behind him. "Look, lady, you're holding everyone up. Maybe you should come back when you're ready to pay in full." He leaned forward, his expression one of irritation disguised as forced politeness. Margaret glanced back at the line, her cheeks burning with shame as she caught the disapproving eyes of a young mother juggling groceries and a crying toddler. Her heart sank further. "I'm almost there," Margaret stammered, her frail hands diving back into her coin purse. She fumbled with the remaining coins, trying desperately to make up the difference. That's when a voice broke through the tension, calm but commanding. "Is there a problem here?" The entire line seemed to turn at once, their eyes locking onto the man who had spoken. Keanu Reeves had stepped forward, his figure radiating a quiet authority that silenced even the most impatient murmurs. His black jacket and casual demeanor contrasted with the weight of the moment, but his presence was anything but ordinary. Alex blinked, startled by the interruption. He hadn't noticed Keanu standing there before, but now the man's calm expression made him feel uneasy. No problem," Alex replied, though his voice faltered slightly. "I was just saying that the line is getting long, and we need to move things along." Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly, his calm exterior giving way to a hint of steel. He stepped closer to the counter, his voice still even but unmistakably firm. "She's trying to pay for her groceries. There's no need to rush her." The cashier opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. There was something in Keanu's tone, a quiet conviction that made arguing feel like a mistake. Margaret turned to look at him, her watery eyes filled with equal parts gratitude and surprise. She didn't recognize him, not as a movie star, but as a stranger who had chosen to stand by her in a moment of vulnerability. Keanu's gaze softened as he met her eyes. "How much is left?" he asked gently. Margaret hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's only a few dollars. I thought I had enough, but..." Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill, placing it on the counter without hesitation. "Here," he said, his voice steady. "That should cover it." The room fell silent. For a moment, even the cashier seemed frozen, his hand hovering over the register as if unsure how to proceed. The weight of Keanu's action, so simple yet so impactful, seemed to ripple through the air. "Sir, that's not necessary," Margaret began, her voice trembling as she took a hesitant step back. Keanu shook his head, his expression warm but resolute. "It's okay," he said. "Consider it a gift, and don't worry about paying me back." Alex finally snapped out of his daze, taking the bill and ringing up the transaction. His hands moved quickly, almost as if he wanted to avoid meeting Keanu's eyes. But Keanu wasn't done. "I don't think you understand what kindness means," he said, his voice directed at the cashier now. It wasn't angry, just steady and measured. "Humiliating someone because they're a little short on change? That's not the kind of behavior anyone should expect here." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Customers in line exchanged glances, some nodding quietly in agreement, others looking away, uncomfortable with their earlier silence. Alex swallowed hard, his face turning a shade of pink as he avoided Keanu's gaze. "I didn't mean to be rude," he mumbled, though his words lacked conviction. Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You might want to think about how your words affect people next time," he said. "It costs nothing to show a little patience." Margaret's groceries were bagged and ready, but she lingered for a moment, her heart overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. She turned to Keanu, her voice shaking as she whispered, "Thank you. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Keanu replied softly, offering her a small, reassuring smile. As Margaret took her bag and slowly made her way out of the store, the tension in the room began to dissolve. But Keanu remained where he was, his steady gaze fixed on Alex, as if silently challenging him to reflect on what had just happened. The silence that followed Margaret's departure was heavy, almost suffocating. Keanu stood at the counter, his calm presence still commanding the room. The customers in line, previously impatient and dismissive, now avoided his gaze, some shifting uncomfortably as they pretended to examine their phones or carts. The weight of their complicity hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Alex, the young cashier, fidgeted nervously behind the counter. His earlier bravado had drained away, leaving him exposed and unsure of how to respond. He felt the heat of Keanu's gaze, not angry, but filled with something much more disarming. "Look," Alex began, his voice hesitant. "I didn't mean for it to come off like that. It's just things get stressful back here, you know?" He gestured vaguely at the register, as if the chaos of the job could justify his actions. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Stressful, sure," he said, his tone measured. "But stress doesn't give anyone the right to tear someone else down, especially not someone who's just trying to get by." The words landed with the force of a hammer, though Keanu's voice remained soft. Alex shifted again, his cheeks flushing deeper as the eyes of the remaining customers bore into him. He could feel their silent judgment, but it was Keanu's steady gaze that unnerved him the most. "She was counting coins," Alex mumbled defensively. "I mean, it's not like she couldn't come back later. Why hold up the whole line?" Keanu took a step closer to the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. "Do you know why she didn't come back later?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Alex blinked, unsure of how to respond. "She didn't come back later because those groceries were likely all she could afford," Keanu continued, his tone sharpening ever so slightly. "And because walking out without them probably wasn't an option for her. What you saw as a delay was someone trying her best to maintain her dignity." The room remained silent, save for the quiet rustle of a bag being loaded in another checkout lane. Alex stared at Keanu, his earlier defensiveness fading as understanding began to creep in. "You ever been in a situation like that?" Keanu asked, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though peering into Alex's very soul. Alex hesitated. He hadn't, not really. Sure, money had been tight when he was younger, but his parents had always managed to provide. He couldn't imagine the kind of life where every cent counted, where a miscalculation at the grocery store could lead to public humiliation. "I guess not," Alex admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu nodded slowly, as though he had expected the answer. "Neither did I. Not as a kid, anyway. But I've met people who have. Good people. People who've worked harder than most of us will ever have to, just to make it through another day." The words carried an undeniable weight, and Alex found himself unable to look away. For the first time, he noticed the quiet intensity in Keanu's eyes, the kind that came from someone who had seen far more of life's hardships than he let on. Keanu leaned slightly against the counter, lowering his voice so only Alex could hear. "When I was younger, my mum worked 2 jobs to support me and my sisters. I remember watching her come home late, exhausted, but still finding time to help us with our homework. She used to count coins, too, when we needed groceries." Alex's breath hitched slightly as the realization hit him like a wave. The man standing before him wasn't just here to lecture him, he was speaking from a place of deep personal understanding. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," Keanu added, his tone softening. "I'm telling you because we all have a choice, every day, to make things easier for someone else, or to make them harder. It doesn't take much to choose kindness." Alex nodded slowly, his defensiveness giving way to shame. "You're right," he muttered, his voice barely audible. I shouldn't have treated her like that. I don't know what came over me." Keanu straightened, offering the young man a faint smile. "The good news is, you get to do better next time, and the time after that. That's the thing about kindness. It's never too late to start practicing it." Alex managed a small, grateful nod, his gaze dropping to the counter as he processed Keanu's words. The tension in the room finally began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. The remaining customers, who had watched the exchange in silence, seemed to carry the same sense of introspection. A few even smiled faintly, nodding at Keanu, as if to thank him for saying what they hadn't found the courage to. Keanu turned toward the exit, his movements unhurried and purposeful. As he passed the line, a middle-aged woman reached out, her voice soft. "That was incredible. Thank you for saying what we were all thinking." Keanu paused, offering her a small, kind smile. "It wasn't about being incredible," he replied simply. "It was about being human." With that, he adjusted his baseball cap and walked out of the store, the bell above the door jingling softly as it closed behind him. Outside the supermarket, the late afternoon sun painted the streets in hues of gold and amber. Keanu stepped out into the warmth, his hands sliding into the pockets of his jacket. His face was calm, but his mind lingered on the scene he had just left behind. The faint jingle of the bell as the door closed behind him was a small reminder of the quiet impact he hoped to leave. But as he walked toward his motorcycle parked near the edge of the lot, he heard the shuffle of footsteps and a voice, soft and hesitant, calling out, "Sir, excuse me." He turned, and there she was, Margaret, clutching her grocery bag to her chest as if it were a lifeline. Her frail frame seemed even smaller now, standing in the vast expanse of the parking lot. But her expression was resolute, despite the faint glisten of tears in her eyes. Keanu smiled gently and walked back toward her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice carrying the same calm reassurance it had inside the store. Margaret nodded, but didn't speak immediately. She took a moment to steady herself, her wrinkled hands tightening around the brown paper bag. Finally, she said, I needed to thank you. What you did in there. It's been so long since someone stood up for me like that." Keanu shook his head softly. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "I just did what anyone should have done." Margaret tilted her head, her expression shifting to one of gentle disbelief. "I'm not sure about that. Not many people stop to notice these days, and even fewer take the time to care." Keanu's smile grew faint, a touch of sadness flickering across his face. "That's the thing," he said after a moment. "Noticing, caring, it doesn't cost anything, but it can change someone's whole day. Sometimes even their life." Margaret looked down at the bag in her arms, her voice trembling as she said, "You have no idea what this means to me. It's not just the money. It's knowing that someone out there still sees people like me, still values us." Keanu placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You matter," he said simply, his tone firm but kind. "And don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." As the two stood there, exchanging quiet words in the fading sunlight, the supermarket door opened again. Alex, the cashier, stepped out hesitantly, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his store uniform. His posture was uncertain, and his gaze darted between Keanu and Margaret, as if unsure whether he should approach. Keanu noticed him immediately and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, inviting him over with his calm demeanor. Alex walked closer, his steps slow and hesitant, until he finally stood a few feet away from Margaret. Alex began, his voice faltering. He cleared his throat and tried again, his eyes focused on the ground. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for how I acted earlier." Margaret's eyes widened in surprise, and she looked up at Keanu as if seeking confirmation that this was real. Keanu remained quiet, letting the moment unfold naturally. Alex continued, his voice growing steadier with each word. "I didn't mean to embarrass you. I wasn't thinking, and it was wrong. You didn't deserve that." Margaret's expression softened, and for a moment, the tension in her face seemed to melt away. She gave a small nod, her voice quiet but sincere. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear you say that." Alex glanced at Keanu, his cheeks tinged with red. "And, thank you, too," he added awkwardly, "for, stepping in. I guess I needed to hear what you said." Keanu smiled, his eyes warm but thoughtful. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said. "That's the first step toward being better. The second step is to remember this moment and carry it forward." Alex nodded, his gaze finally lifting to meet Keanu's. "I will," he promised. "I mean it." As the young cashier turned to walk back into the store, Margaret turned back to Keanu, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've done more than you know," she said softly. "For him, for me, for everyone who saw what you did." Keanu smiled faintly, a quiet humility in his expression. "Sometimes all it takes is one moment to remind people of what really matters," he said. "I just hope it sticks." Margaret gave him a long, thoughtful look before stepping closer, her frail hand reaching out to clasp his. "It will," she said firmly, "because you reminded us all today." As Margaret turned to leave, her steps lighter than before, Keanu watched her go with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He knew this moment wouldn't erase all the hardships she'd faced, but it had given her something that couldn't be measured in coins or groceries: dignity, hope, and a reminder that she wasn't invisible. Keanu turned back toward his motorcycle, pulling out his keys as the golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Behind him, the supermarket seemed quieter now, as if the echoes of the earlier tension had dissolved into something more meaningful. But Keanu's mind was already on the next step. There was still more to be done. Keanu was just about to put on his helmet when he heard another voice call out to him. It wasn't Margaret this time, nor Alex. He turned to see one of the customers who had been in line earlier, a middle-aged man in a crisp business suit. The man's expression was one of uncertainty, as though he had been wrestling with himself before finally deciding to act. "Excuse me," the man began, his tone slightly hesitant. I wanted to say that what you did back there was, impressive." Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying the man's face. "Thank you," he replied simply, his voice warm but guarded, sensing there was more the man wanted to say. The man shifted on his feet, his briefcase swinging awkwardly at his side. To be honest," he continued, "I was one of those people. You know, the ones standing there, watching it all happen. I didn't say anything, I didn't do anything, and I've been thinking about that ever since you stepped in." Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he gave the man the space to find his words, his calm gaze urging him on. "It's easy, you know," the man said, his voice gaining a hint of conviction, "to stand by and let things happen, to think it's not your place to get involved. But seeing how simple it was for you to act, I realized that I could have done something too. I should have." Keanu's lips curved into a faint smile, one that carried understanding rather than judgment. "It's not always easy to step in," he said, "but recognizing that you could have done more, that's the first step. The next time you see someone who needs a hand, you'll be ready." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think you're right," he said, his voice quieter now. "Thanks for that." As the man turned and walked back to his car, Keanu stood for a moment, his hand resting lightly on his helmet. Moments like this, the quiet aftermath of action, were what mattered most. It wasn't just about what he had done for Margaret. It was about the ripple effect, the way small acts of kindness could inspire others to do the same. From the corner of his eye, Keanu noticed the young mother from the line earlier, now loading groceries into her car. Her toddler was strapped into a car seat, happily munching on a snack. She caught his gaze and gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she mouthed silently, her expression filled with emotion. Keanu nodded back, his chest swelling with a quiet sense of fulfillment. As he finally climbed onto his motorcycle, the sound of the engine roared to life, breaking the stillness of the parking lot. He slipped his helmet on, but not before casting one last glance at the supermarket. Inside, Alex was back at his register, his posture noticeably more subdued as he greeted the next customer with newfound patience. Margaret, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen, having left with her dignity intact and a rare sense of hope lighting her path. Keanu revved the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, his figure soon blending into the bustling streets of the city. But for those who had witnessed what happened that day, he wasn't just another passing stranger. He was a reminder, a quiet, living testament to the power of compassion and courage in even the smallest moments. The supermarket returned to its usual rhythm, but the atmosphere inside was different now. Customers continued shopping, carts squeaking along the aisles, yet something unspoken lingered in the air, a shared acknowledgement of the lesson they had all witnessed. At the register, Alex worked with a quiet determination. His earlier smirks and impatience had vanished, replaced by a genuine effort to greet each customer with respect. "Have a great day," he said to an elderly man in line, his tone sincere. The man gave him a kind nod, seemingly unaware of the transformation that had taken place. The lesson Keanu had imparted was sinking in, not just for Alex, but for everyone who had been there. Outside, Margaret walked slowly down the sidewalk, her bag of groceries cradled in her arms. The sunlight warmed her face, and her steps felt lighter than they had in years. As she reached the corner where she often paused to rest, a small bird landed on a nearby bench, chirping cheerfully. She sat down and let out a long breath, smiling softly to herself. Margaret couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind. The kindness of the stranger who had stood up for her, the way he had looked at her as if she mattered. For so long, she had felt invisible, a shadow in the background of a fast-moving world. But today, someone had seen her, truly seen her. As she rested, a young boy on a bicycle zipped past, his laughter filling the air. Margaret looked up and smiled, a small but profound realization settling over her. She would carry this moment with her, a reminder that, even in the hardest times, kindness still existed. Meanwhile, Keanu rode through the city streets, the wind tugging at his jacket as his motorcycle weaved through the traffic. He didn't need thanks or recognition for what he had done. That wasn't why he stepped in. It never was. For Keanu, it was enough to know that he had made a difference, however small. As he stopped at a red light, he glanced at the people crossing the street in front of him. A mother holding her child's hand, a delivery driver rushing to make his next stop, a man in a business suit checking his phone. Each one carried their own struggles, their own unseen burdens. Keanu smiled faintly under his helmet. Everyone's fighting a battle, he thought to himself. We just need to remember to fight ours with kindness. Back at the supermarket, the day moved forward, but the echoes of what had happened lingered. Customers left with more than just groceries. They left with the memory of a moment that had reminded them of something important, something easily forgotten in the rush of daily life. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the world in golden light, Margaret arrived home. She set her bag on the counter, her hands steady now as she unpacked her groceries. She paused for a moment, her eyes landing on the small package of cookies she had hesitated to buy earlier. Her grandson Liam would be home from school soon. Margaret smiled, imagining his excitement when he saw the cookies. A piece of joy she could give him, thanks to the kindness of a stranger. Looking out the window, Margaret whispered a quiet thank you to the world, knowing it would find its way to the man who had stepped in when no one else had. The sun had set, leaving the city bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, Keanu parked his motorcycle at a quiet overlook, the city sprawling beneath him like a sea of twinkling lights. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the handlebars, his thoughts drifting back to the events of the day. To most people, it had been an ordinary moment in an ordinary store, quickly forgotten as they returned to their lives. But Keanu knew that even small acts of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways he might never see. In that supermarket, Margaret had found her dignity restored. Alex had taken his first steps toward compassion, and countless others had been reminded of the quiet strength it takes to do what's right. As Keanu gazed at the city, he smiled softly, knowing he didn't need to be a superhero to make a difference. All it took was one choice: to see someone in need and act. Somewhere in a cozy apartment, Margaret sat with her grandson Liam, his laughter filling the room as he dunked a cookie into a glass of milk. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt something she hadn't in years: hope. And back at the supermarket, Alex rang up another customer, his tone patient, his smile genuine. He was no longer the same person who had dismissed an elderly woman for being too slow. Instead, he carried a new sense of purpose, determined to be better with each passing day. Keanu placed his helmet back on, the cool night air brushing against his face. As his engine roared to life, he thought of something his mother once told him. Kindness isn't about changing the world all at once. It's about changing one moment for someone. He smiled beneath his helmet, the words echoing in his mind as he rode off into the night.